Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And my goodness, do we need help to make sense of a world that really feels crazy. And this is why I'm so glad we have our founding friend, David French, coming back here on the Good Faith Podcast. David, welcome back.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Curtis. I always love coming back.
Well, David, so much has happened in the last couple of months, even in the last month that you and I talked. And even in that last conversation, we had been talking about how Trump was transforming much of American politics. But it feels like in the last month, that transformation has extended globally, such that America's very role in the world is being radically transformed. Can you describe what's happening?
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to use some language here, Curtis, that might seem a little strong, but you're going to see why I say it. Okay, so the way to understand Trump's foreign policy and his interaction with the world is to see him as a Vladimir Putin kind of figure. Okay. And so when I say that, what I mean it very intentionally in in the sense that he sees America in many ways the same way that Putin sees Russia. Okay. So that America is entitled to dominate its neighbors, that America is entitled to dictate policy to its neighbors, that America is entitled maybe even to territorial expansion if it views it in its national self-interest. You know, all of this Canada as the 51st state stuff is MAGA trolls about it. Canada is not laughing at this. Canada is not laughing at this. And there are some indications in some of the trade negotiations that the Trump administration may have some interest in annexing part of Canada. I mean, it's very bizarre. So if you look at it this way, he's looking at it as he is the leader of a very powerful country. Very powerful countries are entitled to dominate their neighborhoods. And this is also why if you look at actually at Vladimir Putin, if you look at the Ukraine war, Trump sees Putin and Ukraine through Putin's eyes, where Ukraine is a smaller, weaker country next to Russia that Vladimir Putin is entitled, in essence, to dominate. This is the country that he is entitled to either rule or to intimidate it so much that he effectively rules it. And so in that circumstance, that worldview is incompatible with the way the United States has approached the world and its alliances for generations, where we have, as a general matter, not always perfectly, and sometimes poorly, but as a general matter, we have stood with liberal democracies. And there's a very good reason in our national self-interest. It's not just moralism as to why we've stood with liberal democracies. There's a very good reason why, and that is liberal democracies don't go to war with each other. And so if you want steadily spreading international stability and world peace, you want steadily spreading liberal democracy. Because when you have liberal democracies don't go to war with each other. Liberal democracies tend to enter into trade agreements with each other, and they tend to become more prosperous. And so the spread of democracy has been in our national self-interest for a very long time, not to the point where we need to intervene militarily everywhere, or we need to be militarily aggressive necessarily ourselves. But as a general matter, the United States has stood on the side of liberal democracy. That is changing fundamentally. And so now what the United States is essentially is standing on its own power and greatness. And it's trying to expand its own power and greatness at the expense even of allies.
And it's operating with a sort of might makes right mentality that seems to be exactly what Putin, operates on, and it almost seems to be the spiritual connection between Trump and Putin is that they both share the same spiritual outlook on the world, right?
I would say so. I think that if you want to see this really made manifest, it's the Trump administration's approach to Canada. Now, I said Canada and not Mexico because Mexico's a complicated situation. We have a lot of drug cartel activity. Drug cartels are horrific I agree with the designation of many, if not most of them, as terrorist, essentially as foreign terrorist organizations. Now, we don't need to be dominating Mexico, violating its sovereignty, etc. But we have a lot of business to do with Mexico to try to secure our southern border from drugs, uh, from wide open immigration, which strains social services. The situation in Mexico is one thing. The situation in Canada is another thing entirely. This is not where fentanyl's coming from. This is our relationship with Canada is not the source of any national crisis at all. It is,
Yeah.
in fact, the source of a lot of prosperity. As both countries, we're principal trading partners with each other. And he is now pledging to potentially destroy the Canadian auto manufacturing industry forever. I mean, what is going on? This is just grotesque bullying for no end, for no purpose. It's actually hurting both of these countries. And the only way you make sense of it is sort of the most extreme story to tell, which is he genuinely is hostile to Canada and genuinely does want something substantial from Canada in return. And it's mystifying, Curtis. I mean, it's mystifying unless you can put it in this sort of Vladimir Putin-esque frame. Under any other terms, it's totally mystifying.
Yeah. And then for the sort of final, but perhaps most tragic piece, talk about what's happening in Ukraine and how this worldview is by Trump is really putting an
Yeah.
entire nation at risk immediately.
Yeah. You see this worldview very clearly. I mean, we've talked about Canada and our quote near abroad. In other words, we're entitled to dominate.
Yeah.
This appears to be the viewpoint Trump has towards Russia and Ukraine, that Russia has won territory. It's entitled to, in essence, keep what it kills, so to speak, that Ukraine holds no cards, Russia holds all the cards. He is trying to loot mineral resources out of Ukraine, sort of as some kind of compensation for our military aid. Curtis, the Europeans have it right. We have switched sides fundamentally in this conflict. We've stopped intelligence sharing with Ukraine, which is costing Ukrainian lives. He is cutting off our military aid, which is costing Ukrainian lives. Now, Ukraine is strong enough and courageous enough with European backing that I don't think a Ukrainian collapse is imminent. But Ukraine's in as much strain as it's ever been. And while I think people are underestimating the Europeans and how much the Europeans can step up, at the moment, American aid is irreplaceable. And so the best way to look at the situation between Ukraine and Russia is not that we're neutral. We've switched sides in this conflict. We're putting all of the pressure on Ukraine. We're adopting Russian talking points. We're adopting Russian propaganda. We're adopting Russian negotiating positions. In the first round of negotiations over the war, Ukraine wasn't even there. It was just us and Russia. And if we're not supporting Ukraine, if we're not a big partner to Ukraine, why are we even there? What's our role? If we're going to pull out completely and not support Ukraine and not provide any aid, why are we negotiating? It's not our country. So he is not only pulling aid, he's purporting to negotiate on behalf of a country or against a country that we're not supporting. I mean, this
And
is
David,
absurd, Curtis.
it is absurd. And David, is there any way in which you can just, tell everybody in the rest of the world, hey, this absurdity is Trump. We hope he's going to go away in 4 years. Still trust us as a country. Does international politics work this way?
No, 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 no. He's broken what you cannot easily fix here,
Yeah.
because what he's demonstrated is that America's alliances are one election away from dissolution.
Yeah.
And that is not a stable environment in which to enter into international agreements with the United States. So, I honestly think, Curtis, it would take a generational repudiation of this MAGA populist movement before anyone will trust America again. Because they'll sit there and they'll say, oh, this is all well and good. Let's say you have another president in the future who has a different view of alliances. Well, this is all well and good, but I know next election, if you don't get the price of eggs under control or whatever, then everything you say, every agreement you enter into can be broken, can be breached. And And when you combine this with the withdrawal of all funds or the vast majority of funds for humanitarian foreign aid,
Hmm.
and it's starting to look like, in many ways, we're almost like a rogue country. You cannot count on our agreements. You can't count on our contracts. You can't count on our alliances. We will turn and bully our neighbors. We will turn and try to intimidate and maybe even annex territory from allies. That is the behavior of a rogue country. That is
Yeah.
something that if you were looking at a foreign nation behaving like that, you would say they are becoming a rogue country.
I think everything you're describing for anybody who has what I hope are basic good human values, whether you're a Christian or not, you would agree with is really disastrous, wrong. It's a tragedy. One of the missions of the Good Faith podcast is to help thoughtful Christians have theological language to describe what's happening in the world right now. And so I want to, David, if you will allow me to step in and put on my
Yes,
theologian's
please.
hat for a second. I think this actually gets to the importance of a theology of institutions, with a nation being an institution. Because we're not talking like we were just talking about, that what's happening is just there's one person like Trump who's going rogue, but that he's leading the entire nation to change its role and presence and character in the world. And so the way to think about this is I always invite people to go to Colossians 1:15-17. It's one of the most important passages in the New Testament. It's called the hymn of Christ because apparently the early church regularly, repeatedly sung this passage. And it begins with the words, "The Son is the image of the invisible God," which means if we want to know what God is like, what God's like in the world, look at the Son, look at Jesus, right? So if we look at Jesus, we see somebody who is talking about, hey, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are the last. Who says to people, if you care for the least of these, you're caring for me. So Jesus, the Son, is showing a God who cares for the weak, who is not just about might makes right, which was very much also the dominant worldview in first century Greco-Roman society, is right. But so Jesus is a direct repudiation of this idea that, look, all that matters is just power to dominate in the world. And so the Son images this invisible God in this character. Um, and then it says, but he's not the only image. He's the most perfect image, but he's the firstborn over all creation, which means there's like these other images. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and earth, visible and invisible. Now here's the key. Now the passage does not say the other image bearing kind of beings are individuals or families or couples. What this hymn, this regular statement the early church said is the other image bearing beings are that we want you to remember are thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. These are image bearing beings that even this early small little church had this audacious political imagination to look out at all these empires, all these rulers, at Caesar, and said, you know what? Your role is to image the invisible God, this God who cares for the weak, cares for the poor, who has power, but is not about just wielding power to dominate and get its own way. And so this is the way which why we have to think about nations, thrones, rulers, authorities, and other large institutions as they're meant to image something about God. And I really believe like there's such a thing as national character, that different nations image different aspects of God's character. But David, I want to ask you, when you think about the American national character, what are some characteristics that you think are really what America was meant to image? Now, again, not perfectly. No,
Yeah.
no image does this perfectly, always with contradictions, but at its best, what is America trying to image? It should be imaging in the world.
Yeah, I think at its best, what we should be imaging is exactly what we state right up front in the Declaration of Independence,
Hmm.
that all men are created equal and were endowed by God with certain unalienable rights. And so, if you begin with that premise, that declaration in the Declaration of Independence, that is a powerful moral declaration that has implications, really, that has implications that radiate across the world,
Hmm.
especially as the United States has become more powerful and a more dominant economic and military power. And that is a fundamental belief in human dignity and human liberty. This is what we are at our best. We believe in human dignity and human liberty. And in fact, the fact that we do have that North Star
Yeah.
is has really been a key element in making the United States a better place, because of that declaration, because of that statement in 1776. We've always had this North Star to aim towards and to indict ourselves with.
Mm,
So if Frederick Douglass can come along and say, what to a slave is the 4th of July. Why can he say that? Because he can point to something from the 4th of July,
right.
1776, that stands in contradiction of the reality. Why can Martin Luther King say, I'm coming, we have a promissory note? Well, what is the promissory note? It's that fundamental moral declaration that slowly, haltingly, sometimes taking 3 steps forward and 2.99 steps back, we have moved towards that North Star. And that's how you evaluate our national character, I think, Curtis. Are we moving towards that North Star or away from that North Star? And right now, we're absolutely moving away from that North Star. I mean, you cannot look at the MAGA movement and say this is a movement that believes in its bones that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. No,
Yeah.
no, 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 no. Their allies are endowed with unalienable rights. For their enemies, there is nothing. For their
Yeah.
enemies, there is pain. For their enemies, there is suffering. And you just see this pattern, not just in foreign affairs, but in domestic affairs. They pardon their own thugs and bullies, and they take action and reprisals against political opponents. I mean, this is a pattern that's been unfolding every day of the Trump administration. And so this is a time in which America is deviating from its North Star. Not the only time in American history, by far not the only time. It's not the only time of regression. But if you're looking at the North Star of our national character, that declaration in the Declaration of Independence is right there. And are we moving towards that, or are we moving away from it? Absolutely, we're moving away from it.
David, you said this is not the only time that we have regressed from it, because I think, one of the things that's so shocking, disorienting, upsetting to most Americans is the sense that, like, this has never happened before. We are living in unprecedented times. We're kind of off the map, so to speak. Can you speak to that feeling? Because
Yeah.
it seems like what you're saying is like, hey, everybody, we've been in this something like this territory before in American history.
Yeah, yeah. And it's funny, sometimes when you say we've been in this before, that can sound comforting, but it shouldn't be, because we can look at the consequences of what's
Right.
happened when we've been in this before. So, one of the first and easiest examples that comes to mind is, after the Civil War, there were ambitious plans for Reconstruction.
Yeah.
And for a while, it appeared that there was some actual hope that Reconstruction could be truly a reconstruction, essentially a rebirth of the South. And
Yeah.
the forces of the old Confederacy were trying to reinstitute as much of the badges and incidents of slavery as they could, Union troops, and were keeping them at bay. And then during that period, we had black senators and members of Congress and representatives, and then all of a sudden, the people of the North grow weary of all of this. And so in the Compromise of 1877, the Republicans and Democrats got together, kept the White House in Republican hands, threw black Republicans under the bus by agreeing to end Reconstruction. And so when Reconstruction ends, here comes Jim Crow. And so we deviated from that North Star. And for almost a century, from the Compromise of 1877 to the Civil Rights Acts in 64 and 66, you had just profound inequality and oppression in this country. Just profound. I mean, it would not be unfair to call the South in the Jim Crow era essentially an apartheid state. So we
Yeah.
had an apartheid substate in the United States of America. So that's one consequence of backsliding. Another one is, we fought a world war, World War I. Woodrow Wilson, who in many ways is a villainous figure in history. He resegregated the federal government. For example, he would imprison political prisoners who objected to the war. Um, and yet and so after, but he did want to create a international network of alliances to prevent another world war. That was supposed to be the war to end all wars. And instead, Americans wanted to retrench right back into our borders. And we kind of left our allies high and dry, even though we were the most powerful economy in the world. So we left our allies high and dry. That left them, they, through a combination of their own military weakness and their own moral weakness, Hitler rose, and we had a much worse Second World War. So there are times when American mistakes can just be utterly catastrophic. And what I'm really worried about is that we're in a period of backsliding right now. And if it continues for very long, it could be potentially historically catastrophic.
All right. And so, David, what are you, when you hold all these sort of possible scenarios, as is your job to do
Yeah.
so, how are you holding those with also your faith? Like, this is what also a lot of folks are trying to get some guidance on, is they're seeing, okay, things are bad. What does this mean for me in my own
Yeah.
faith?
Well, we've talked about this several times on this podcast, Curtis, this idea that, actually we might be moving into the way that most Christians have lived through most of history,
Yeah.
where we're actually exiting a period of time that was historically unusual, which is you had a very, very large Christian population living in a country that, by and large, imperfectly, was bent and aimed towards justice and liberty. That in many ways, for a lot of, this was the best place to live in the world
Yeah.
if you're a practicing, a seriously practicing Christian. You enjoy extraordinary liberty, a huge community of fellow believers, so that even if you are somebody who thinks, well, I really don't like the way the mainstream media or the way in which like elite education or some elite institutions look down on Christians, okay, I don't like that either, but my gosh, you've got this giant, powerful Christian community in this country. Uh, American Christians don't lack for community and fellowship. I mean, so we're we're coming out of a period of time that we may look back on and say we had that historically good
Yeah.
and spent every second of it waiting for some sort of doom. And then when the doom did happen, we're the ones who did it. And
Oh,
so
great.
it's a, but yeah, I do think that, what might be moving into really is a kind of life and a kind of world that is really, really, really familiar to most of the Christians who've lived on this planet. And it is,
Hmm.
I'm trying to live faithfully for Jesus Christ in a nation that is in many ways hostile to justice and profoundly unjust. And that is the way Christians have been operating in the world for most of our history. And so I think that a lot of this is a matter of maybe reconnecting with Scripture through that lens. I'm reading Scripture through the lens that's more similar, that is through a lens that reflects that I am not in the dominant position.
Yeah.
That and when you read, that is the position of Christians in the New Testament.
Yeah. Well, the passage that I spoke about, Colossians 1:15 to 17, again, that's the exactly what, David, you're describing, which is it's a small group of Christians, probably just a handful, reciting to themselves this cosmic belief that in the end, all of this points to Jesus, and Jesus, who is the firstborn of creation, will ultimately return to achieve the reconciliation of all things, which is what Colossians talks about later. And that's what we hope for, and that's what and if our nation no longer can be the image bearer that our nation's practices have become so defaced that it does not point to that hope of the God who loves the fatherless, who loves the weak, who defends the poor. If our nation no longer can point to that, then, well, that's our job. Then
Yeah.
we have to point to that.
Well, and we're also maybe moving into this stage that's familiar to Christianity, that is where there are, in essence, a state like we can't have a state church in this country the way we have because of the Establishment Clause, but we could move into this situation where you essentially have something like what you might have had in parts of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, where there are these very powerful, very unjust church institutions.
Yeah.
At that time, they were allied with the state, sometimes part of the state. But you had, on the one hand, extraordinarily unjust elements of Christendom, where Christians were exerting worldly, earthly power in a profoundly unjust way. At the same time, that there were Christian dissenters who are keeping the flame alive. And that we might in this country be moving into something like that. Because as
Mm,
I said earlier, one of the characteristics of this Trump presidency is it is brought to you by the evangelical church. I mean, this
right.
is, we went through these numbers before. 82% to 17% voted for Trump, and who are evangelicals. It was 58 to 40% for Harris with everybody else. And so we're in this very weird situation, Curtis, where faithful Christians may need to be dissenting from a movement brought to you by other Christians,
Yeah.
and very reminiscent of sort of the profoundly unjust ways in which Christendom inflicted itself on its neighbors in earlier periods of world history.
David, you and I have been involved in a project called the After Party, which has been trying to help Christians be able to speak to other Christians, perhaps even Christians who are supporting Trump. And we've been doing that by giving them a how to talk about things. And one of the things we talk about is like, you don't have to talk about politics all the time. You want to build relationships so that you're not always just talking about the thing you disagree on. But David, it seems like sometimes, especially if you have the right opportunity, you do want to talk about politics. Because if you have built the relationship on good, solid enough grounds that you can listen with respect, that you have agreed upon kind of values and rules for discussion that we've outlined in the after party, there comes moments when it's like, well, it's time for us to talk about something important. And it struck me that when the Trump administration eliminated almost overnight USAID, that was a topic that if you had a relationship with a person who voted for Trump, and that you could actually have a rational conversation, right? You could have a conversation where each side could actually feel like they were being listened to one another. That was something to talk about, because that was something that was actually very clear to me. Look, this is against any kind of impulse we would have as a gospel. This is just wrong. This contradicts even what Christian supporters of Trump have said that Trump would bring. Like, so what I want to ask you to do, if you were to advise somebody who's going to try to talk to their MAGA uncle or aunt or spouse
Yeah.
even, or whatever, right? Look, can we talk about what just happened here with USAID? What would be your talking points? Give them their talking points here.
The thing that you're going to have to realize is you're going to be talking to somebody who is open, but they're almost certainly not open in any way, shape, or form to sort of like repudiating their vote. Okay. So if you're wanting to get someone to say you were wrong for voting for Trump as a result of these things, then expect people to just absolutely dig in with 17 different talking points about how bad Kamala Harris was, et cetera. So if your point of the conversation is to say you were wrong, then you're almost certainly not going to get anywhere. If the point of the conversation is to say this is wrong about USAID, you might have some real opportunities. So you're not sitting there going and talking to this person and say, see, I was right. See, there's chaos. See, and people are very alert for that, by the way, Curtis. I mean, this is, a lot of people are very alert for the I told you so, and just shun it, reject it, hate it for a billion different reasons. But if you can just, the past is the past. We're not talking about 2024. We're talking about March of 2025. And you say, is it right to eliminate tens of millions of dollars of funding from Christian ministries that are serving the poorest of the poor and the most vulnerable? Then you can start to have a conversation and you can actually get somewhere with that. Now, again, not with hardcore MAGA, because what hardcore MAGA is doing is they're just doubling and tripling down. They're saying, well, if World Relief or World Vision took government money, that just proves they were the swamp and they're corrupt, et cetera. But for people who have a view of an understanding of, hey, we long for a long time, the conservative movement wanted these public-private partnerships, and the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives was George W. Bush's very first executive order. I mean, PEPFAR was one of the greatest things this country's ever done, and it was Bush and Michael Gerson's Christian faith that really put that front and center. And if we talk about that, I think you have a real chance to get somebody to say, this is wrong. This is wrong. But I can already see, like, online, the discourse online is they want everyone to stampede to, I was wrong for voting for Trump. I made a mistake in voting for Trump. And I understand why people want to hear that, that especially folks who've been just absolutely attacked, humiliated, intimidated, threatened for opposing Donald Trump. They want some personal vindication. But I think it's much more productive, instead of saying you are wrong, to say this is wrong and try to
Yeah.
bring someone along.
Good advice. All right. Well, you know what, David, we have some questions for you, because we are planning to have a Ask Me Anything that I'm going to answer a lot of those questions. But some of those questions that we got in the Ask Me Anything request were actually specifically directed towards you. So I'm going to tee up some questions for
Let's
you.
go.
These are actual listeners. The first question is from Kelly, and it's a little bit along the lines of this whole question of how do you evaluate the vote for Trump. Kelly writes, I am curious if there are any Trump actions that you, Curtis, and David think might actually be positive for U.S. citizens. Less bloat and bureaucracy, illegal immigration actually curbed, anything really? And just to clarify, I'm not a Trump supporter. I'm just trying to look at the silver lining, if there is one at all.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say I do believe that, the border had become much more under control over the last year. This is something that the Biden administration really, really, really dropped the ball on. And I haven't even heard very many Democrats defending the Biden administration's record on the border. But by the last year of his term, he had brought the border much more under control. It is much more under control now, and that's a good thing. The level of border entries that we had were just unsustainable. We could not have that many people coming in at that kind of pace. And so coming down to a more manageable inflow of people, I think, is a good thing. So that is a positive. Outside of that, Curtis, I'm really having trouble, because even some of the areas that I would have some appreciation for, so taking on some of the excesses of DEI, particularly where DEI devolves into explicit race-based preferences or suppression of free speech or due process, I'm all in favor of protecting civil liberties against, DEI excesses. But he's gone so much further than that. He's gone so much further than curbing DEI excesses. And even on some things where, I might have some points of agreement, such as women's sports should be for people who are biological females. The anti-trans actions are so excessive, so over the top, that, it's not merely sort of saying, okay, in these specific areas, we're going to, where sex is particularly salient, we're going to protect female only spaces. It's way beyond that. And so, Curtis, I do think at the border there are some good and positive developments, but outside of that, it's very difficult, because even some of the things that he would like, that conservatives would traditionally like let's say the tax cuts, but not in this circumstance, not when you're talking about the amount of debt that we have. And
Yeah.
so it's very difficult, because even the things that are directionally where a conservative like me might have some hope, the execution is so miserable and malicious as to be counterproductive is too mild a word. It's so miserable and malicious as to be just profoundly unjust.
All right. I have a question here from Samuel, who was a young man who was adopted from Ethiopia and raised in the United States. He said, after months of deliberation, I decided to vote for Donald Trump in the 2024 election, a decision I did not take lightly, and yet a decision I do not regret. Um, and he talks about how he utterly repudiates the treatment that professing Christians have given to your family, especially around your daughter. So that's nice to say that. But he says, I have a question for David. Have you been around any Christians who do not idolize Donald Trump and yet still voted for him?
Yes, yes. Although I will say that that share of that percentage is decreasing. So if you were going to look at immediately after November 2016, the median approach that I experienced from people was I held my nose and I voted for him.
Right.
And so that was the normal approach. By 2020, the normal became I'm in the boat parade. Like, I love this guy. Now, not everybody, again, not everybody, but we did see this switch between 2016, especially early in the 2016 cycle, where the more you went to church, the less likely you were to vote for Donald Trump. By 2020, that had all switched. By 2020, the more you went to church, the more you were likely to vote for Donald Trump. And so by 2024, it wasn't just enthusiasm, especially in a lot of the more Pentecostal parts of American Christendom. It was reverence. It was fanaticism, and especially kind of following the assassination attempt and other things. There is this sort of really building sense of Trump as almost like a Christ figure, standing in the way, taking the legal attacks for us, even taking physical attacks for us. And so by 2024, the percentage of Christians who were, I know who Donald Trump is, and even though I recognize that he is not the person that I would like to see, that I'm going to vote for him anyway because the Democrats are worse, was a diminishing segment. And how could you tell this? One way you could tell this is there was an actual primary, and evangelicals pushed Donald Trump over the edge more than any other group. Pushed him to the nomination more than any other group. And so that's why I'm really, really down on the talking point that says, well, he wasn't my first choice, but he's better than the Democrats. I would be very interested to hear from any of the person who says that. A, did you participate in the primary? And if you did, who did you vote for? And B, if you did not participate in the primary, why not? Why not? Why didn't you vote for somebody else other than Trump in the primary? Because there are a slice of evangelicals who were Haley voters who then voted for Trump. But the big bulk rejected Haley and DeSantis and everybody else for Trump. And so I'm just not as sympathetic to that argument in the aggregate as I was. There are certain individuals who fit that, who fit the description of I really was holding my nose here. But in the aggregate, that is no longer the case.
Okay, we're going to finish up here with some final questions for you, David. You ready?
Yes.
All right. This is Beth. Beth says, I don't really have like-minded non-Trump Christian friends. It's a really tough place to be. I wondered if you have thoughts or advice about those of us standing alone, trying to be faithful to Christ, but feeling alienated everywhere.
It's incredibly lonely. It's incredibly lonely. And I actually think it can be unsustainably lonely unless you actually do find at least some like-minded fellowship. If you are just all alone, the thing that worries me about that situation is that the social dynamic and the social pressure is such that you eventually begin to reach a point, unless you're a person just who's extraordinary, where it's sort of conform or lose everything.
Mm.
That do I, finally yield and sort of join with the group, or does the fact that I'm stubbornly refusing to yield and not joining the group slowly but surely building wedges and building distance to the point where they don't want me or I don't want them, one or the other, or a mutual separation. And so I think that trying to find community, not exclusively of like mind, that's dangerous. That's dangerous. We talk about that a lot in other circumstances, but if you have nobody in your life where you have that, where you can just take a deep breath and let your guard down and sort of be yourself and be who you are and not feel defensive. If you have nobody like that, that's a very hard place to be in life. And so I would encourage you to try to seek out and find that fellowship. Um, Try to seek out and find people who you might know of who are of like mind. And that could include maybe getting involved with a political or cultural organization that you see doing work that you like. That's always a great way to build friendships. It's not necessarily walking up to somebody and saying, "Will you be my friend?" It's joining with people in virtuous activities and virtuous service. And so I think maybe trying to seek out and find an institution that is doing the kind of work that you really like, and maybe joining with that work with the hope and expectation that you'll build some relationships. Because in my life, I'm very thankful to have a balance between people who are very close to me, who are just really of like mind in as we approach this moment, but also a broad array of people in my life who are not in agreement with me, who did vote for Donald Trump. And I actually think that that mix of people it's very healthy to have that. If it was all one way or all the other way, then that would be, I think, bad for me.
Yeah. All right, David, I got two more questions. One, this is from Jerry. And this is what Jerry says. David, I think you may be verging on the hysterical a wee bit, although I do agree with you that the actions of President Trump seem extreme, to put it mildly. The problem I'm having with being vocally against Trump at this point is that I see many of the things he is doing as being absolutely necessary to save America from bankruptcy. The millions upon millions of dollars expended on projects that I am completely against without any checks and balances indicate to me that the Democratic Party has lost its way completely as it pertains to the founding fathers. So what's a voting American to do? Continue to vote for Democratic policies and get more of the same? Um, um, so, David,
I'm
I think
afraid
there's an
our I'm
obvious
afraid
flaw
our
in his
cor-
logic
I'm
here.
afraid our correspondent is presuming some facts, not in evidence.
Yeah.
Donald Trump is not saving America from bankruptcy. I mean, he will say that he's saving America from bankruptcy. And I'm very glad for that question, Curtis, because it illustrates a problem that we have right now. And the problem that we have is between Trump and Musk, two of the most prominent individuals in the United States of America, who have the largest bully pulpit, arguably in the world, they're just relentlessly lying, relentlessly lying. And so if you look at Doge is not saving the United States from bankruptcy. Nothing about Trump's plans is saving the United States from bankruptcy. In fact, Trump's plans that he's articulating would add on the low end $2.8 trillion in additional debt. Now, to put that into perspective, I had Jessica Riedel on, I talked to Jessica Riedel in connection with a New York Times podcast. Jessica is a scholar at the Manhattan Institute, conservative think tank, who might be one of the foremost experts on the federal budget in the United States of America. I mean, people across the spectrum know that Jessica is a straight shooter and that Jessica knows the budget, okay? And so Jessica said, look, let's put this in perspective. If you cut through all the hype, Doge maybe Curtis has saved around $2 billion. $2 billion with a B. That's a lot of money. $2 billion is a lot of money by anybody's normal understanding. But Trump is proposing adding 2.8 trillion to the deficit. Okay. Let's put that in perspective. That's 2,800 billion. 2.8 trillion is 2,800 billion. So that is 1,400 times the amount of savings that Doge has achieved so far. Okay. Now, if you keep cutting down the federal payrolls, you'll save more money, maybe 40 billion, 50 billion. If you really cut, like if you just cut. Again, those are rounding errors on our deficit problem. As I said before, the Trump plan is to add 2,800 billion to the deficit. That's even if, and that's Curtis, if they achieve a Medicaid cut of almost $1 trillion, which is probably not going to happen because that's a lot of Trump's base. So one of the problems that we have is people come to you and they'll say, David, why can't you support Trump? You're being too hard on him. He's doing A and B and C that are good, but he's not. He's not doing A or B or C that are good. If he was, I would have a more mixed, nuanced picture of the situation. So a lot of times what I'm receiving is people coming to me and they're saying, Trump did A, B, C, and D. Why can't you acknowledge how good that is? And I'm like, he did not do that. He did no such thing. And yet people will have seen Fox News where the administration officials are going on Fox and they're trumpeting fake figures constantly. Um, and it really does. If you're listening to right-wing media, it sounds like this guy's like, he's got Elon Musk, got the hood up. He's under the hood fixing things. Instead, he's a bull in a china shop. He's breaking things. And some people, again, hardcore MAGA, they're like, good, things need to be broken. But most people don't want to break these things. Do we want to break weather forecasting? Do we want to break air traffic control? Do we want to break, you name it. Do we want to break PEPFAR that saved 25 million lives? And so
National Institutes of Health has
national,
produced some of that. Yeah.
do we want to break the vaccine schedule? We've got a measles outbreak in Texas,
Yep.
So it's sad. It's frustrating, but really it's sad at how many Christians, good people, are being completely led astray by just remarkable liars, And nothing right now is happening that is what you would consider to be a fundamentally positive structural change.
Yeah.
And to the extent that we have blitzed relationships with allies, we may have had a fundamentally negative change already that could last a generation.
And do you have any sense, David, that this is Curtis Chang asking the question. I've got two. You're going to end with two questions from Curtis Chang. The first
Okay.
is, what's your sense of where the Democratic Party is as a form of resistance to this? And
Mostly in a state of confusion, but moving, I think, imperfectly in a productive direction. So I do think there's just an enormous amount of shock. Not that Trump won, because a lot of people thought Trump could win, but that he won the popular vote and that essentially the Democrats lost ground with every demographic category except for like college educated white men. And so the Democrats lost ground with Hispanic voters. They lost ground with black voters. So it's not just that they lost to Trump, it's that they lost ground in some of their core constituencies. And so, but I would say what's happening, some of it is circular firing squad, no, you're to blame. No, you're to blame. But a lot of it is actually quite productive. So you're seeing some movement away from sort of far left extremism and intolerance. You're really seeing that a lot of the center left is just over and done with the concepts of cancel culture. They see it rightly as having backfired in a horrible way, just in a very toxic way. Also, what you're seeing is sort of a greater openness to, and folks are beginning to realize that it's just too hard to build houses in blue cities. It's just too hard to create new, like billions and billions and billions have spent, and there's not 1 mile of working track in California high-speed rail, right? That a lot of stuff that in these big blue institutions is just not working right. And so, my colleague Ezra Klein has a book out that is talking about Democrats and an abundance agenda. How can you sort of reignite this idea that Democrats can be the party of prosperity and dynamism? And so I do think you're beginning to see some green shoots stirring within the Democratic Party. At the same time, however, it's really too soon to tell sort of who's going to emerge as the real standard bearer for the Democrats.
yeah. Okay, last question, David, is one that I've been very curious about for you, because your job is to regularly monitor the news at a very detailed, comprehensive level. I have found that when I try to just even begin to read the newspaper, I just get so depressed and discouraged
Yeah.
that it's like I want to push it away. Like, Jody, please don't even put the Wall Street Journal on the counter. Like, I don't even want to see it. So, David, I'm really curious. Like, how are you sustaining yourself when you are, as you are doing this detailed analysis of the news, you are seeing so many things that seem, well, frankly, hopeless. Like, and I want you to ask it, I want you to answer this question explicitly as a Christian. How, as Christians, do we retain our hope in hopeless times?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to talk about a piece that I read recently from Jake Metter at Mere Orthodoxy that
Mm.
was, I thought, really poignant and powerful. And he was talking about how Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings adaptations were really good, except they did miss one thing. And I kind of got my hackles up as I was reading because I'm thinking, no, they did not. Those are those film adaptations. Are you kidding me? They're incredible. But as I was reading, I thought, oh, you're right. And he was talking about how both Lewis and Tolkien have a theme in their writing, which is essentially faithfulness in the face of hopelessness.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
isn't
Hmm.
necessarily that the theme of the writing is always triumphing against impossible odds. So Jackson nailed that, triumphing against impossible odds. He really nailed the ethos that Tolkien had of shunning the will to power. He really got that. He really got that. But I began to see what Jake was talking about, that there is this strain, there is this element. And especially when you look at sort of like Tolkien in full, like you really dive into the nerdery of it all, that there's also this strain of there's always these people are keeping a flame burning,
Yeah.
always, even if they will not see in their lifetimes, they will not see the consequence of their lonely stand, which while they live and die, they don't achieve victory. So they don't live in the generation of Frodo, they don't, they live in dark generations and dark times. And that concept, which is a biblical concept of a remnant,
That's
the
right. Yeah.
6,000 who've not
Yeah.
bowed the knee to Baal.
Yeah.
The thing that I love about that is that whole concept of a remnant, a faithfulness, even in the face of hopelessness, is that a remnant speaks of lament. It's a smaller part of a larger whole. So there is something to grieve here that,
Yeah.
yeah, we have lost something. But the remnant is maintained because of a future hope,
Yeah.
that this is the soil from which the new green shoots will grow. And so I think that kind of thinking about it in along those lines of there is, and I'm still mad at my friend Jonah Goldberg for having a podcast called The Remnant when I wanted that, but he got there first, fair and square. But I do think that that concept of a remnant actually gives me a lot of purpose
Yeah.
and a lot of hope,
Well,
because
it
it's
is
a
such a
it's a
deeply
biblical
biblical
model.
hope. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
such a deeply biblical model. It is the model for the early church, and should be for the church in all times. That at one level, every church at any point in history should be looking around and saying, this is bad. This is why the dominant way that the Old New Testament talks about this age is this evil age. And it meant like any age. Like what would
Yeah.
be this evil age would have been, actually, whether it's
Yeah.
1800s, 1900s, whatever. There was no age that was not, in biblical terms, right, this evil age, which meant we were looking forward to the age to come. This is the contrast that the New Testament has. And the age to come is when the King, Jesus, returns to this world. It's not we go away to heaven. It's when Jesus returns to this world. Christ has died. Christ has risen. Christ will come again. We pray, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. So that's the hope, is that in the age to come will come. We pray for that. We hope for that. And Jesus will come and will defeat all evil, defeat the bullies, and protect the weak. And we don't know when that's going to happen. It may not happen in our lifetime, but that is the flame, David, right, that we keep alive.
Amen. Well said.
All right. Amen to that. And folks, thank you for joining us in this conversation, especially in these very grim times. We do need to be together to keep the hope alive. Thanks very much. And we'll see you next week when we gather around the campfire.